we have a unique opportunity that we've never had before to move the needle on a whole range of issues really important to entrepreneurship.
With each episode of the Make Startups podcast, we explore the stories of founders, investors, philanthropists, and policymakers. This episode features John Dearie, president at the Center for American Entrepreneurship and co-author of Where the Jobs Are. We learn about John's evolution from working in the Federal Reserve to CEO of Financial Services Reform to founding the Center for American Entrepreneurship. We discuss the importance for startups in America, the role of government and of capitalism itself. Find out more about the Center for American Entrepreneurship's policy framework and support their critical work by joining Team 500 at startupsusa.org. And now, here's your host, Eric Parker.
Welcome to the Make Startups podcast. Today I have with me John Dearie. John is the head of the Center for American Entrepreneurship. And for those that don't know, I actually personally believe that his work is perhaps the most important work in the field of supporting entrepreneurship today. And one of the most important things that's happening in our country. I know that sounds lofty, and but the simple fact is entrepreneurship is key to so much of the promise of America itself. And one of the reasons we have a podcast here called Make Startups is because we believe in that so much. And so, John, I welcome you today. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work and how you created the Center for American Entrepreneurship and really what's been going on in the state of our country to support entrepreneurs.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. So, I guess first off, for me, it really, the origin story is always the most interesting thing, because I like to get at the why for every business that's out there. And, I haven't finished your book. I have to say that logistics are not ideal in this world right now, but I've read through about half of it, and it's amazing to me how prescient it is. I think that you were writing this at the same time I was going through a lot in my own life with the recovery from the 2008 recession and trying to figure out how to create a system that was more resilient. And yeah, I'm just really curious about your journey to get there, and what were the things that sort of informed you in, leading up to 2008 and then in the immediate aftermath.
Sure. It is a good story, not because it's about me, but it's because it's about the incredible story of American entrepreneurship and how important it is, especially now in the as we continue to struggle with the economic damage imposed by COVID. So I'm new to innovation and entrepreneurship, comparatively new. I've been at this for about 7 or 8 years all told. But my background is principally in banking and financial policy. I began my career after graduate school at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I then went to a financial and economic policy organization. I should say I was at the Fed for almost 10 years. And then I went to a financial and economic policy organization called the Financial Services Forum, which is a membership organization comprised of the chief executives of the largest financial institutions. I was there from 2000 until 2017 when I left to launch CAE. For most of that time, I was the policy director at the forum. And I was there before, during, and after the financial crisis. The forum was originally in New York City, but then we moved to Washington when Hank Paulson, who was then the chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs, who was our chairman at the forum, when he became chairman, he moved the forum down to Washington. So that's how I came to Washington. I had been in New York for 15 years. That move turned out to be highly prescient. We got down to Washington in late 2005. By the summer of 2006, Hank had become the Treasury Secretary. And then 18 months after that, the financial crisis hit. And so I had a ringside seat to the run up to, the experience of, and then the aftermath, the policy aftermath of the financial crisis, and got about 20 years of Washington experience packed into about 3 or 4 years. But it was as we were coming out of the financial crisis, as you might recall, the economy began to grow again after the end of the Great Recession. The Great Recession ended in the spring of 2009 officially. So by the spring and summer of 2011, the economy had been growing by only about 2%, but it had been growing for about 2 years, but very slowly. And unemployment was still north of 9%. 25 million Americans, 2 years after the economy began to grow, were still unemployed. And you could feel this sort of collective shrug in Washington, D.C. On the part of policymakers. They had thrown the kitchen sink at the problem in terms of the Recovery Act, a number of other programs that Congress passed. You might recall these funny names: cash for clunkers, cash for caulkers, cash for this, cash for that. The Federal Reserve, of course, had come in massively and controversially with 3 rounds of quantitative easing, 0% interest rates. That they've done everything that they could possibly think of, and yet we were not getting the kind of traction in terms of economic growth and job creation that anybody thought that we would get, and everybody was quite puzzled. And so I went to the CEOs as the policy director and said, we need to do something new and innovative to provide policymakers with some new ideas regarding economic growth and job creation. And they said, great, go do it. I had no idea what my angle was going to be, so I started to do my homework on the nature and sources of economic growth. And I found some research that was new at the time. The first papers had been produced in 2009 and 2010 by economists at the University of Maryland, Census Bureau economists, other academic economists around the country, subsequently picked up and reanalyzed by folks at the Kauffman Foundation, that showed the following 3 remarkably intriguing realities. One, new businesses, and we can talk about what that means, but very quickly, generally speaking, when they talk about new businesses, they generally mean younger than 5 years old. Sometimes folks will get even more narrow and talk about less than 1 year old, but for the sake of argument, young businesses, new and young, less than 5 years old, are disproportionately responsible for innovation in the economy. And that makes sense if you think about it. The reason why, or one big reason why somebody starts a new business, they have something new. They have a new product, a new service, a new twist on an old idea. The economics behind that, as we know from the great work of Robert Solow, who was an American economist who won the Nobel Prize for this insight in 1987, that innovation drives gains in productivity, doing more with less, which is the principal driver of economic growth. So as the disproportionate source of innovation in the economy, new businesses are absolutely key to economic growth. Relatedly, number 2, new businesses account for virtually all net new job creation in the economy. In fact, if you look at all businesses, this is what the research by people like John Halterwanger and other people showed. If you divide all the businesses in the economy into 2 simple categories: those older than 5 years, those younger than 5 years, regardless of size or industry sector, just older than 5 years or younger than 5 years. Those older than 5 years tend to, on average, shed about 1 million jobs a year. As they get better at what they do, as they get more efficient, as they incorporate capital and technology. Another way of saying that is, were it not for young businesses that add about 3 million net new jobs a year to the economy, the jobs base in this country would shrink by about 1 million jobs a year. So
yeah,
new businesses.
That's definitely one of the things that. So I'll say that's almost become a mantra within our industry of, startups are responsible for all net new job creation. And we say it honestly, even without even really thinking about it anymore. It's like muscle memory. And so sometimes I do like to try to think of ways to challenge that notion, to make sure that we stay sharp in how we look at things. But I think that the critical thing to look at is, I think capitalism itself seems to rely on this almost a circle of life of companies in the same way that we have with people, and that we seem to have set up a regulatory framework that's wholly around preserving the things that are old and established and doing something, and constraining the ability for us to have new life come into the system.
Right. And part of the reason why that is that in our policymaking city, Washington, D.C., those incumbent industries and businesses are very well represented. And so it's not surprising that the economic and regulatory framework, the architecture of our economy is tipped in their favor. And that's part of the reason why we started CAE.
Right.
The third intriguing piece of the puzzle that I just wanted to mention, because it's the real head slapper, or it was for me, is that new businesses or new business formation in this country has been in decline for many years, both in absolute terms. It's been in decline since 2006. And more importantly, the portion of all businesses in the economy that are new, or the piece of the pizza of all businesses in the economy that are new, has been in decline for 4 decades. And this is the mirror image of the dynamic, the much discussed phenomenon of the economy becoming more and more concentrated. So if you put those 3 observations together, new businesses are disproportionately responsible for innovation in the economy, which is the principal driver of economic growth. New businesses account for most net new job creation in the economy. And new businesses or new business formation has been in decline for 4 decades. You don't have to be a policy genius to start asking the question, maybe this is why, despite the Herculean policy efforts, going on in Washington, D.C., which have been aimed at incumbent industries, as you just pointed out, are not getting the kind of traction in terms of economic growth and job creation that everybody wants. I was watching, at the time that I was sort of internalizing all of this, I was watching Raiders of the Lost Ark with my son at one point. And you remember the scene when Indiana Jones discovers that the bad guys are digging in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, my God, that's exactly what's been going on in Washington. Policymakers are digging in the wrong place, because I knew, having been in Washington and worked in Washington at that point for 5 or 6 years, startups were not on the radar screen of policymakers in Washington. So I became wildly intrigued by this problem, and I went to all the economists who had been documenting all of this as a first step in my project, and I said, "Why is this decline happening? Why is this 4-decade decline in new business formation happening?" And they said, "We don't know.
Yeah.
We have certain suspicions and theories, but fundamentally we don't understand it." And I thought to myself, "Aha."
Yeah, so I'm really curious, because I think anyone that's in entrepreneurship really understands this aha moment. Can you put yourself back in that place and just describe what went through your head at that point? Was this it happened just like that, or was it this gradual aha?
Well, the real aha happened a little bit later, but this, as I said, you don't have to be a genius to put those 3 things together, with the reality, based on my experience, that I knew that entrepreneurship and startups were not on the radar screen in Washington, to be wildly intrigued about, we've got, why is that decline happening? Because if we can get some kind of insight as to why that decline in new business formation is happening, then we might be able to put together a policy agenda designed to address it.
Right.
So the way that I and another colleague decided to go at that, it took us a while to figure it out, because if all of these brilliant economists around the country hadn't figured out, how the hell am I going to figure it out? But the way that we decided to try to get at it was, it occurred to us, if you want to know what's going on with entrepreneurs, one good way to figure it out probably would be to get out of Washington, D.C. and go ask them. So that's what we did. We hit the road for 3 months, and we conducted roundtables around the country with entrepreneurs in 12 states around the country. And it was the most transformative experience of my life, intellectually.
So tell me what cities
and that was the aha moment. That was just to answer your question, when I heard from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs what was in their way, and I began to hear the same problems popping up all over the country, talked about in different ways. I mean, often that there was a regional, difference in the way or emphasis in the way that they talked about them, but fundamentally, that there were 6 or 8 major themes coming out of these roundtables, and I realized that we had learned something, found something that was so important, so consequential, and that nobody in Washington knew, that it occurred to me, this is the big idea of my career. This is the big thing that nobody's focused on, and it completely changed the course of my career.
I certainly understand how that happens. I'm really curious because with, I've coached probably 100 startups at this point, and a big part of that process for everybody, in our industry speak, it's customer discovery, and really your roundtables to me were a customer discovery process in a very true sense of trying to figure out what is the challenge that entrepreneurs face. But I think what's interesting is that how you got to the answer. My assumption here is you didn't go in to that saying, I know how to fix the problem for entrepreneurs. You went into this saying entrepreneurship has a problem, right? And you were just there to ask those questions. Because what I see is that most entrepreneurs have a real difficult time separating their product from that process. And so they spend so much of their time guiding people as far as, what answers they do want. And I'm curious if there was any keys for you in the process of conducting these roundtables across the country that you think helped you really come around a more accurate answer for what the problem was.
Yeah. Well, our job, I think, was really, as you say, to listen, first of all, and then as policy people, because policy making is a craft, like any other profession, that is, if you go to policy school, as I did, you learn how to break down problems into their elements, and then there's how do we address this? How do we formulate a solution to this? And then how to affect it in Washington or at state and local government. And that's a political science kind of how does the government work? How does public policy work? How do ideas and legislation and regulatory changes get enacted? That was our job. One thing that we needed to overcome is we would sit down with these entrepreneurs, and we learned over the course of our experience doing the roundtables how to ask the questions. So the first couple of roundtables, we were stupid, and we sat down with entrepreneurs and said, what policy issues are in your way? Not thinking that entrepreneurs don't think in terms of, and in fact, as soon as we said that, it conveyed, it's sort of the expression, Ronald Reagan's famous expression, the 8 most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from Washington and I'm here to help. Right. And the response that we got from entrepreneurs is, we have no need for government or Washington in our lives. Quite the contrary. The farther those folks stay away from us, the better. And when we heard that a couple of times, we realized we were asking the question the wrong way. And so we started to ask them, tell us about the major challenges and obstacles that you deal with as an entrepreneur. And then we started hearing things that the entrepreneurs didn't realize were policy issues, but we started hearing things like, I can't find enough people that have the skills that I need. That's an indictment of our education system, but that's and particularly with regard to STEM skills. I can't find enough domestic people, and I can't augment that gap because I can't keep foreign-born talent in the country. They keep running into visa problems. Well, that's an immigration policy issue. Then they would tell us all about access to capital and all the difficulties that they were having with access to capital, which of course is, a whole range of public policy. And then they would talk about how regulatory burden, uncertainty, and complexity was driving them crazy. And a few of them would talk about tax problems. So before long, we began, to see these problems in 5 or 6 policy categories. And we sort of, we then turned it around and thought to ourselves, how do we convey this to policymakers in a way that they're going to understand this? And the way that we decided to do that, and the way that we've constructed our agenda at CAE, is to ask the very simple question: what do entrepreneurs need to thrive? They need great new ideas. They need the talent and the capital to pursue those ideas with as few unnecessary or stupid distractions as possible. It's pretty much that simple. So under the new ideas category, you have things like research and development, tech transfer and commercialization issues. There's a whole bunch of problems and issues associated with the way that we commercialize federally funded innovation in this country. And that's a major part of our agenda. Talent is education issues, it's workforce readiness, it's immigration policy, access to capital, all kinds of issues in terms of access to bank capital, angel capital, venture capital, regulatory and tax issues, a whole bunch of issues under those two categories. And so that's the basic structure of our agenda. And our job is really to take what we hear from entrepreneurs, filter it through our policy expertise, and then convey to policymakers, both in terms of educating policymakers about why entrepreneurs and startups are so important to things that policymakers care about, like economic growth, job creation, rising wages, expanding opportunity, to make the point that this is the bullseye of what you're trying to do. You need to focus on this part of the economy. Here are the issues. Here's a whole list of potential solutions. That's what we do.
Yeah, it always seems to me like, and this is what I love about, not the thing, but one of the things that I love about doing entrepreneur support work is it seems to be one of the few nonpartisan, bipartisan areas left in our country, right? I don't think anybody opposes the idea that I've encountered of new business creation and new job creation. However, at the same time, what I see, from my experience and from all the people that I work with, and I do think that there are geographical differences. I think that there are certain clusters in America that have set up a support system that seems to work and it allows for this churn of innovation to happen. But what happens in most of the country is you really, as an entrepreneur, have to put everything on the line in an environment that seems completely stacked against your ability to succeed. And that, I look at it and say, we've designed an entire system that we no longer even call education. We call workforce development, as if we're training you to go work for whatever big companies are out there, as opposed to think for yourself and have some independence and come up with an idea. And then let's say you survive that system and you actually say, like, oh, I have this problem that I see in the world and I believe I can solve it. This company's not solving it, so I'm going to try to solve it and create a new market. The only way you can get capital to do that is to mortgage your house, to go without health insurance. Hopefully you've got a friends and family network that can give you some sort of safety net. And then if you manage to get that company off the ground, as you're saying, the workforce in your community hasn't been educated to a level that you can really grow and thrive. And so you're almost forced to further concentrate activity into one of the few innovation hubs that are left in the country. And if you fail, you've lost everything.
Right.
That doesn't seem like a winning scenario for a country.
No, it's not. And those barriers, two observations about the barriers and risks that you just pointed out, they've gotten worse over time. That's part of our understanding of why business formation rates, entrepreneurship has been in decline. And those risks fall disproportionately on aspects of the population that are historically underrepresented or more vulnerable. So those risks that entrepreneurship entails, those barriers or hurdles, if you will, everything from access to capital to healthcare, et cetera, are especially high for women entrepreneurs. They're especially high for entrepreneurs of color. And so there is a social justice aspect to the difficulties of becoming an entrepreneur that you talk about. But the overall difficulty of being an entrepreneur is very much not in the interest of the country and the nation, and it's especially not in the interest if the burdens and the risks fall disproportionately on certain sectors of the population. It's not a surprise that entrepreneurship in America today is overwhelmingly white and male. And if changing that and diversifying entrepreneurship is a major aspect of what we do at CAE, not just because it's the right thing to do, but if we're going to turn around this 4-decade decline in entrepreneurship as the essential pathway back to the kind of economic growth, job creation, opportunity, rising wages that the American people need and deserve, we need much higher rates of participation in entrepreneurship among women and entrepreneurs of color. And so we have been developing relationships with policymakers in Washington, in both the Senate and the House, who have that goal as a special interest, as addressing the special needs and special burdens and obstacles encountered by women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color, as we address the full range of issues facing entrepreneurs in general.
Yeah. So, I look at this and I say that, what we fundamentally have developed is a short-sighted way of looking at the economy in so many ways. That the question I have around that is, and I know this is really big picture, do you think that right now is, like, I almost look that capitalism itself is failing in some way. And at my core, I still very much believe that capitalism is a tremendous part of uplifting people in this world through innovation, through this churn. And I almost wonder if, like, in your mind, why are we in America failing at capitalism right now? Because it seems to me that we've been a bastion of it for for as long as I've been taught, in my education in school. We were sort of the centerpiece of capitalism in this world. And it seems to me that right now we look at it in such a tremendously short-sighted way. And I know it's a broad philosophical question. So,
well, I think you're right. I think capitalism. All you have to do is look at the inequality in society, and there are lots of measures of that in terms of wealth and income disparities, poverty rates. Any society, any economic system that produces very wide disparities in well-being, particularly if those disparities are defined in terms of either geography or the color of your skin or your ethnicity, it's hard to defend that. And there's no question that in recent years, these sorts of economic disparities in the United States, that have always been there for sure. But I think that there's a consensus that these disparities have worsened. And you see it in our politics. It's not a coincidence that our politics on both the right and the left have become much more defined by populism. Populism is an expression of the frustration and the anger of tens of millions of Americans on both the right and the left, who are sending the signal that the system isn't working for us. And we want it changed, and we want it changed in fundamental ways, or we want the system burned to the ground. Right. And so we are at a very dangerous place in our economic and political history. And unless we address some of the issues that are driving these inequalities, it's not just that the economy is in trouble; the country is in trouble. Right. And I think two of the very encouraging movements right now that I think are there's a growing consensus around, and that are the beginnings of trying to address that, are the shift that you have seen large business groups, a lot like the Business Roundtable, endorse a move away from, and there's a lot of talk and discussion about this because the 50th anniversary of the very famous essay written by Milton Friedman was just in the last couple of weeks about that CEOs of corporation, their only responsibility is shareholder value.
Right.
But the shift away from shareholder value focused capitalism to stakeholder value capitalism, that there are more issues, priorities, and values that CEOs need to be concerned about. Among them, things like equity, access, inclusion, et cetera. And then, of course, this growing interest that we're a part of and that you're a part of, and all the work that you're doing there to focus attention on entrepreneurship and the ability of people who are new, who are insurgents, who are threats to upsetting the incumbents. The barriers and the risks that they encounter need to be reduced. That is in the interest of society and the economy. Those two trends, I think, are very, very positive for addressing the long-standing problems that characterize American capitalism in 2020.
Yeah, well, and I know we are, we're having this interview just a few days before an election. It seems like the nation, at least in my lifetime, has never felt more divided. And one of the frustrations that I have in the work that I do right now is I feel, obviously there's a pandemic, so everybody's thrown off of their normal game of how they would operate. But entrepreneurs in my community are at this point where some of them have actually just fully given up on this being a viable path. And I asked the question about capitalism because I have some of them that even really actually want to debate me whether, socialism or communism is a better answer. And this is going back to what I said in the beginning, why I think the work you're doing is perhaps some of the most important work that's happening in this country, because this is the answer, in my view, of how we move out of this, the bifurcation that's happened within the economy, how there's such a tremendous difference between the concentrated centers of wealth and the vast sprawling. You look at a map of the US and, sadly, it's like red and blue it's also an indication of where there's wealth and where there's not wealth.
Right.
And so people are pissed off right now.
That's right. And justifiably so.
Yeah. And so maybe one way to ask this question is, what do you view as the point of the regulatory framework of government?
Well, that's a big, broad question, but there are a couple of fundamental purposes of the regulatory framework. One is to provide the rules of competition, to define the playing field, if you will, and to try to do that in a way that is as fair and equitable as possible. That ideally would include enabling newcomers, entrepreneurs, insurgents, to enter the playing field and to challenge those who are already on it.
Because right now you have the newcomers playing on a field designed by the people who've been there forever. That's
right. That's right. And and just to give you an idea of how that observation translates into a policy option, we, if you go to our website and you look on our policy agenda under the category of regulatory reform.
What's your website address?
It's startupsusa.org. One of our proposals with regard to regulation is to develop a light touch regulatory framework for startups during the critical first 5 years. That would be comprised of only the most essential product safety, environmental protection, and worker protection rules. The idea being that it's very hard for a startup that wants to challenge IBM, for example, to be dealing with all of the regulatory framework that IBM deals with, because the startup is tiny and doesn't have the size and the resources over which to amortize the cost of all the regulatory burden. So the idea is to create something of a regulatory on-ramp, if you will, to provide some regulatory relief and certainty during the critical first 5 years, after which startups, hopefully if they survive, will then become subject to the standard regulatory regime. But that's a perfect example of a purpose of the regulatory framework. The other one, of course, is to provide certain protections to cushion the rough edges, if you will, of capitalism and competition in a capitalist framework. And those are things like product safety rules, environmental protection, worker protection, so that the worst aspects of capitalism don't do damage to our society and to people and workers in the environment. So the two principal objectives of regulatory framework is to establish the rules of competition, the field of play, and to provide for these sorts of protections to make sure that we're a decent society.
Right, and so obviously there's a constant chant that goes on in society that regulations are killing businesses, and I would tend to agree that exists in a certain way, but that our response to how we ease regulations isn't actually doing anything to help new businesses. And so first off, why should we create a regulatory environment that encourages startups? I mean, I know we've really addressed that to a large degree, but to me, that's the first is saying, do we have a moral responsibility to do that? And then if so, what do you think, is there one silver bullet, or do we really need to touch on all of these areas that you mentioned before, with education, with capital, with immigration, and so forth? Like, how can we get the biggest bang for our buck early on?
Well, I do think it's a moral obligation, and I do think part of what we are trying, our message in Washington, is the policymakers need to focus on entrepreneurship and the needs of startups, because they are so important to things like economic growth, job creation, expanding opportunity, rising wages. These are the metrics of economic well-being and the quality and progressiveness in an economic sense of a society. They come disproportionately from startups. Therefore, policymakers whose job is to pursue policies that enhance conditions and circumstances for the citizenry need to be focused on this aspect of our economy. It is the bullseye of what they should be focused on. That's our message. So yes, absolutely, there is a moral obligation, in my judgment, for policymakers to focus on this part of the economy. Your second question, no, there is no one silver bullet, and that's the other aspect of our job, is to try to simplify these issues in a way for policymakers to be able to understand them and be able to address them in ways that are going to have impact without doing unintended damage. And as I said, the way that we have simplified that for them is to ask that very simple question: what do entrepreneurs need to thrive? Great new ideas, talent, capital, and relief from regulatory, tax burden, complexity, and uncertainty. And then we have all kinds of ideas in each of those categories. And how we pursue those ideas is a very important part of our job is to develop and to cultivate and maintain relationships with key members of Congress, key committees, key staff of the key members and key committees, the people who do the work on the issues that we care about, and to be constantly in touch with, engaging where their interests are, which always changes. Sometimes they're really interested in access to capital issues. Sometimes they're really interested in regulatory issues. Sometimes they're really interested in education reform or immigration reform. And so we maintain and cultivate those relationships. We have our policy agenda ready, so that when we see opportunities, when somebody calls us or in a conversation says, "Hey, my boss is interested in doing something on X," we're ready. The reason why we started CAE is that, if you're going to pursue any kind of agenda in Washington, you've got to be on the ground. You've got to be on the ground because you've got to be doing the day-to-day blocking and tackling of relationship building Washington is very much a relationship town. Key staff on the Hill have to know, who are the people I trust on this particular issue? Who do I know is an honest broker? Who do I know has the discretion that I can bounce an idea off of them? Or who can I go to for a really good possible solution on an issue that my boss is interested in? You've got to have that relationship and have been developing it over time so that they know who to call and they know who they want to work with. And we've been very fortunate in just the 3 years that we have been around, that we've been very successful in establishing that kind of credibility. And you know that you're a success in Washington when, the first year it was us calling them and asking them for a meeting. Hey, can we come in and talk to you about entrepreneurship and CAE? And then what starts to happen is they start calling you.
Right.
Hey, we have an idea, or my boss would like to do something on this issue. We know you guys are active on this. Would you come in and talk to us about your thoughts and your insights on this issue? And that's how it works.
So I guess really then, we sort of talked through your roundtables, and that's what led to, I guess, first writing the book, right? And your book is Where the Jobs Are, correct? And
yes, it's a little stale at this point, I have to say, because it was written in 2014. I don't want folks to run out. It was really written in the immediate aftermath of the Great Recession, but interestingly, in the context of COVID and the damage that COVID is having on the economy and jobs, a lot of the ideas and concepts and even the circumstances of the book are fresh again. But if people really want to see the latest version of our policy ideas, the best source at this point is our website.
Sure. Yeah, no, I guess where I wanted to go, that was because even what I see, obviously now, we're in circumstances that in some ways echo what we went through in the 2008 to 2010 timeframe. And we do a lot of work at Make Startups around entrepreneur training and education and trying to navigate the regulatory issues around the workforce development system to improve that process. And there's so much of what we've found in doing that was actually created right in the aftermath of the Great Recession in the 2010 era. There was a lot of thought leadership that was happening at the Department of Labor around the role of entrepreneurship in economic development that I think was coming about the same time as what you were doing. And so whereas absolutely, I can understand that some of the ideas are, they've been around the block. Maybe they caught traction, maybe they didn't catch traction. But I think it's worth sort of revisiting a lot of those things.
Absolutely.
Today. And one of the things that I really thought was intriguing was the E-Corp proposal that you had within the book. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, or if you think that that's an idea that could have legs.
That was the I believe that's the idea that I was talking about earlier, that if new businesses or startups ought to have a special status that gets them access to this light touch regulatory framework, and on ramp to regulatory compliance of the larger and more mature companies. And so we came up with this idea of an E-Corp, an entrepreneurship, a startup corporation that would be so designated by the IRS and would get both preferential regulatory treatment and also preferential tax treatment during the first 5 years. On the regulatory side, it's that light touch regulatory framework of which I talked about. And the idea would also be, it wouldn't just be light touch, but it wouldn't change. One of the things that we've heard from entrepreneurs, things that drives them crazy, is regulatory changes or new regulations are constantly, coming at them and distracting them from what they're supposed to be focused on. So the idea would be that when a new cohort of new businesses would launch, say in 2020, they would be subject to a light touch framework of regulations that for them would not change for 5 years. Even if the framework changed for the next cohort, wouldn't change for them. So they would know here's the framework within which I'm operating, and I don't have to worry about it changing for 5 years. Same thing for taxation. The similar sorts of problems reported by entrepreneurs. One, very few startups actually have income, taxable income in the first 5 years. But to the extent that they do, taxes become an access to capital issue. As one entrepreneur told us, every April the tax man comes and takes a third of my operating capital.
When I started my first business, I went through a calculation after my second year of operation. And at that point in time, even as a startup, 60 cents on every dollar that the business brought in, either through the corporate tax or through the payroll tax or through my income tax, ended up going back to the government in that year. And and don't get me wrong, I certainly think, the great thing about paying taxes is it means you're making money. So that was a good thing in a lot of ways, but it really hampered our ability to reinvest back into the company in those early days where we could have established enough of a market presence to, as we've discussed, really create a lot of jobs at that point in time when we were in our early expansion mode.
Right. And so our idea, and we hear that sort of experience a lot at roundtables I should also say that we continue to do roundtables with entrepreneurs. We get out of Washington on about an every 4 to 6 week basis and go do a roundtable somewhere around the country. In the 39 months or so that we've been around, we've done 25 roundtables. It's an important way to stay in touch with entrepreneurs, and we hear that all the time. So the tax aspect of our E Corp idea is, first of all, startups would be exempt from payroll taxes. And second of all, if you do have taxable income, for the first 5 years, you'd be subject to a flat 5% income tax. Very low, very predictable, very simple, and it won't change. If you make a dollar of income, you pay 5%, and you can count on it. And with that kind of predictability and that kind of a very, very low tax rate, the idea is that startups would keep 95% of what they're making, virtually all of which goes back into the business and increases the chances that they're going to survive, and that we don't want entrepreneurs to be distracted by and wasting time with income tax complexity and constant changes. They know for 5 years, here's the regime I'm subject to. Great, I can build a business around that. So that's the idea of the E Corp.
Right. Well, so then take me from, you did your roundtables, you wrote a book. Why on earth did you decide to start a nonprofit to do this work?
Well, it did not make my wife happy, I can tell you that. But as I was finishing the book, and what we do in the book is we recount what entrepreneurs all over the country told us, divided into certain categories for some organization in the book. And then we made a first crack at a policy agenda, a 30-point policy agenda based on what entrepreneurs told us. As I was finishing the book,
how are you funding your ability to do that work?
Well, I was doing that while I was at the forum, and I wrote the book. It came out of a major project that started at the forum. I got permission from the forum to do it, so I wrote the book on the side, at night and on the weekends. It was a very tough experience. But it was published at the end of 2013. But when I was finishing that book, it occurred to me, I don't have any organization to hand this book to. There's no organization in Washington, as evidence of the degree to which entrepreneurship was not on the radar screen in Washington. There was no organization in Washington, D.C. dedicated to working with policymakers to educate them about the realities of what we're talking about, the importance of entrepreneurship, startups, their needs, et cetera, and then to work on a policy agenda to address those identified needs. There was no organization in Washington, which is astonishing because there is an organization for everything in Washington. I mean, I used to live in Alexandria, Virginia, and across the street from our apartment was the Association of Florists. The American Association of Florists. Florists had representation in Washington, but entrepreneurs did not. Crazy. And so So after thinking about it,
one of the things that we've noticed in our work, and it's is the core challenge of entrepreneurship is it's industry agnostic, right? And so every industry vertical that exists under the sun is represented some way. But I always try to explain that entrepreneurship is a really more of a skills horizontal that crosses into every industry of how do you address market challenges and design innovations to address those and ultimately create jobs from it. And I think that what you are doing is helping to organize that as an actual recognized industry. And I think that's what's so valuable about your work right now.
Yeah, well, our observation was, when I made the observation there is no organization in Washington, well, why is that? Well, it's obvious, because entrepreneurs are busy as hell trying to survive and building and growing their businesses. They have no extra capital lying around or extra time lying around to organize themselves in Washington. But the problem is, if you're, the old expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Or at the very least, if you're not being represented and educating policymakers about why you're important, why they should focus on your unique needs, they won't be addressed. And then you get the system that you're talking about that's tipped decidedly in favor of incumbents. So long story short, after talking to a number of people who had helped me with the book, I went and talked to Steve Case, I talked to Bob Lighton, I talked to people all over the country. I decided, well, we need that organization, so I might as well start it. So I left the forum. By that time, I was the acting CEO of the forum. So I had become the leader of one of the most prestigious Wall Street groups in Washington after 16 years there, and was doing very well financially, and had my established perch that I could have spent the rest of my career. And as I said, much to my wife's chagrin, I said I want to leave. And I want to start this organization. And the reason is, going back to your original question about the aha moment, I realized, as I said, that the country was then and still is now, because of COVID, in trouble, because we're growing too slow. We have all these economic disparities, this polarity in terms of wealth, income, and opportunity. Entrepreneurship is the essential pathway back to the kind of economy that provides the growth, the jobs, the wages, and opportunity that the American people need and deserve. This is, as you said, this is the most important work right now for where the country is. And as a policy person, as soon as I recognized that, I was like, I have to do this. I mean, this is the big idea that nobody has realized.
What I kind of want to tell anyone who's listening to this podcast is that if you are an entrepreneur, if you are a policymaker, if you're anywhere in the government framework or economic development framework and you understand the value of entrepreneurship, if you are someone who runs an incubator, if you are an investor, if you are struggling with immigration issues to bring people into your business, sounds to me like we actually got a gamer to try to lead the charge in DC, because you walked away from quite a lot to try to improve the framework so that all of these seemingly disparate interests can be more successful. Because, as you said, there's an entire playing field that's been designed without their representation at it.
Yes, and it's very important for your listeners to know that the good news is we have been remarkably successful in just 3 years. Part of that is because, as you indicated earlier, entrepreneurship is something that once you explain it to people and you connect the dots for them in their minds, it's a very bipartisan issue. People want to be working on and associated with new business formation, economic growth, job creation, and they're really interested in the problems that entrepreneurs are facing. And so we've had a great response from policymakers on both sides of the aisle to our message. One of the most concrete examples of that response is that we were able to establish last year Entrepreneurship Caucuses in both the Senate and the House. And for your folks who are unfamiliar with the nature and purposes of caucuses, caucuses in Congress are best. The best analogy is they're clubs. They're informal associations of members of Congress around a particular topic that they're very interested in. And it gives them an opportunity to learn about the topic. It gives them an opportunity to do events, roundtables, and most importantly, it's an automatic constituency of members of Congress for pieces of legislation that might move having to do with that area. And there are hundreds and hundreds of caucuses on all kinds of topics in Congress. My favorite examples to make that point are there is a river trade caucus, and my all-time favorite is there is an unexploded ordnance caucus. But there had never been, I mean, this is a vivid example of the extent to which entrepreneurship was not on the radar screen in Washington. There had never been an entrepreneurship caucus in either chamber of Congress until last year when we established them. So there's now an entrepreneurship caucus in the Senate that is co-chaired by Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota on the Democratic side. Tim Scott of South Carolina is the Republican co-chair. That was established in March of last year. There are 17 senators who are part of that caucus. And then in October, the House Entrepreneurship Caucus was established with 6 co-chairs because the House is bigger. But the point is, people wanted to be part of these caucuses. They were established. And the caucuses are an informal but very important part of the policy making machinery on the Hill. And so now that we have a caucus in both chambers of Congress, an audience, a constituency of members of Congress who are really interested in this topic, we have a unique opportunity that we've never had before to move the needle on a whole range of issues really important to entrepreneurship. So I think that that's a tremendously encouraging thing. And then, of course, you put that against the backdrop of the economic damage associated with COVID. Entrepreneurs and startups are going to lead the post-COVID recovery. Policymakers understand that. And so I think that 2021 is going to be a very, very big year for entrepreneurship policy. So to your point and your invitation that you just made to your listeners, I would encourage anyone who's interested in entrepreneurship to get involved, follow CAE, support CAE, help us do the good work, the important work on behalf of entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and I'll tell everyone, you have a program that's called Team 500, which I have actually also signed up on.
Thank you.
Let everybody know that right up front. But can you tell everybody about Team 500?
It's a very simple idea. We have invited, our hope is to get 500 people to contribute $500. And that's why we call it Team 500. We thought that was a reasonable amount to ask, a relatively doable lift. And I should say that CAE is very small. We're a very small staff.
How many
punch. There's only 3 of us full time, and then we have a number of consultants that serve as force multipliers.
And how many policymakers are there in DC that need to be communicated with?
535. But we are backed up by a remarkable board of directors and advisory council. People can see who those folks are if they go to our website. I think it's the best collection of entrepreneurship expertise and experience ever assembled, certainly in Washington. It's people from all over the country who work with entrepreneurs, are entrepreneurs, invest in startups, a couple of academics who work on entrepreneurship. We as I said, have been enormously effective in Washington, in part because of the receptivity to our message, but we're also very good at what we do. So Team 500 is an invitation for 500 people to give us, contribute $500. It's tax deductible, of course. We operate on a shoestring budget. And so if 500 people contributed $500, that's $250,000. That's almost half of our annual budget. So it's a real retail way for people to get involved in the work of CAE. Obviously, if people wanted to contribute something more than $500, it's very easy to do. Just go to our website and click on the donate button. But we thought that the Team 500 invitation would be a reasonable and attractive option for people to get involved.
Just to be clear, if someone is struggling right now and $500 is too much, can they contribute whatever amount they want?
Of course they can. That they can contribute anything that they want at the donate button on our website.
So I think I met you around 2 years ago I took part in one of the Kauffman Foundation's policy days on the Hill.
Right.
And in that, I think you did a really great job of talking to us about kind of a few things. One is how we can better engage policymakers in the work that we do. And really, I learned a lot on that trip about that they actually do care, which was intriguing. And then also, I think one of the things that really stuck with me was understanding that there's been great success of getting policymakers to champion small business in America, but they still don't seem to understand new business. And I know we've talked a lot about the definition of a new business being, generally speaking, less than 5 years old, even if there might be some disagreement about that. How much traction do you think there's been in developing that consensus understanding in Washington at this point?
There has been, we've made a lot of progress. And as you can imagine, that was the substance of most of our work in the early months after we launched CAE. My colleagues and I, essentially lived in the congressional office buildings doing hundreds of meetings with key members of Congress and their staff. And one of the very first tasks that we had to do was explain to them the difference between existing small businesses, which they're very familiar with and are very well represented in Washington, by the way, and new businesses. Most policymakers at the time, and even a lot of them today, when they think of entrepreneurship, they lump new and small businesses in together. And it's our view, based on the economics and the research associated with startups, that they need to be thought of as different. Similar, certainly, there's a lot of overlap in terms of issues and challenges, but there are key differences. In terms of the economic role, it is new businesses, the research shows, that are disproportionately responsible for innovations in the economy. As we talked about earlier, people start new businesses because they have something new. The importance of that is that innovation is the driving force of gains in productivity, which drives economic growth and job creation. So the economic role of new businesses and small businesses is different. Moreover, new businesses are very fragile. I like to think of them as toddlers. They have enormous potential, but are easily knocked off their feet. Problems and challenges that can be a pain in the neck for small businesses can be fatal for new businesses. So both from the standpoint of their economic role, their contribution to the economy and the things that we're focused on, economic growth, job creation, opportunity, and because of their fragility, it's important to think of new businesses differently. They have different policy needs than existing small businesses. And it's been, a major task for us to educate policymakers about that reality, to get them to think about them in different ways. And there's, some resistance, frankly, because small business is a very powerful lobby in Washington. It's very politically and intuitively appealing. And we have encountered some resistance on the part of some policymakers. They feel that, to be focused on or acknowledging the importance of new businesses is somehow to turn away from, the needs or the importance of small business. And we don't see it that way at all. Both are enormously important to the economy and to our society, but their needs are different. And it's important to understand the differences.
Yeah, well, I always think of, new business is basically just the process of bringing more people into the fraternity of business ownership, right? And some of them are going to be small, some of them are going to be big, but there is something that's distinct about being new.
Right.
One of the things that I've found in the world of supporting startups is there seems to be a great value that's placed on high growth, high tech, innovative companies. And there seems to be less acknowledgement and understanding of, I would say, more broadly, inclusion related entrepreneurship of how, we often talk that there's, we've supported 100 businesses that have created over 1,000 jobs. But what that also tells you is that, the average company size is 10 employees or less. It's not like this is the creation of a company that creates 1,000 jobs. And that seems to be mostly what economic developers and policymakers that I talk to want to hear. They want the story of the 500 person, 1,000 person company. And, do you see a distinction in the levels of support around those two types?
Well, I think you're right that there is probably somewhat more interest among policymakers in the high potential, high impact is the way that it's often referred to, technology-based startups. It's sexy to the extent that a new business of that sort does grow very fast from the standpoint of revenue and job creation. It has an outsized impact, and policymakers. It's very important to put yourself in their shoes. They are elected officials, and they want to go back to their districts and their states with great stories. And new businesses that grow very fast and create a lot of jobs and a lot of money, and that make a major impact in their state or district is a great story to tell, especially if they had something to do with that. So there's a natural, just by the nature of the game, there is a natural focus on those types of businesses. But generally speaking, I think that there's also, in the minds of many policymakers, a real affinity for the small business, the small, the startup that is going to remain small. It's going to be a 10 to 15 or 5 person operation. Let's
be clear, in America, the definition of small business is less than 500 employees, right?
Well, right. And that's very big, obviously. And you very often hear small business association or small business administration, I should say, or small business trade associations making the point that 99% of the businesses in the U.S. economy are small businesses, and the definition that they use is less than 500. It's also true, though, that about 80 to 85% of the businesses in the U.S. economy have fewer than 20 employees. So, I think that that's a more revealing figure because, the U.S. economy, is the mightiest economy in the world. We tend to think of the U.S. economy in terms of the great, corporations that have been launched and that thrive here in the United States, and that's very important. But it's remarkable that 85% of the businesses in the United States have fewer than 20 employees. The U.S. economy is a small business economy. Of course, all those businesses at some point, both the small businesses and the major corporations, began as startups. And so we want more of those, from a national or economic standpoint. It's in the interest of everybody that there is a thriving pipeline of new entrants, from the standpoint of innovation and new products and new services and new ideas and dynamism. It's in everybody's interest for that priority to be attended to and cultivated as carefully and as effectively as possible.
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the things that I really look at is that, and this might get to some conversations that might get me in trouble in certain circles, but I look at so much of what the U.S. policy making and administrative issues, like how they go about encouraging activity and granting money or providing support systems. So at the EDA level, the U.S. Economic Development Administration level, it seems to be entirely centered around, are you doing high growth, high impact, technology innovation related businesses? And so there's not a lot of support available for I go back to the mass amount of geography of America that doesn't have the perfect cluster of research institutes and investor networks to accelerate these high growth companies. So it's too risky. Using my case in Augusta, Georgia, it's too risky to try to start a high growth, high tech business there. It's so much easier to just pack your bags and move to New York, Chicago, Boston, Austin, San Francisco than it is to be in this community and do that. But then on the flip side, you look at the SBDC and the SBA programs, and for all the work that they do, I think that most people in the startup space feel like they aren't served really in any capacity because they're still built primarily around traditional lending operations, which require levels of existing assets that you can leverage. And so I still don't see any traction really around supporting broad-based entrepreneurship in this sort of, I don't care what business you're creating, just create a business. It seems to be almost entirely focused around this innovation sector.
Yes, and so much of what the federal government does from the standpoint of economic development is focused on existing businesses. And I can't remember the specific problem that, when we met a couple of years ago, you brought an issue to us. I can't remember the details, but I do remember that part of the problem was that the qualifying criteria to get the assistance that the government program was supposed to deliver, those criteria were defined decidedly in the context of existing small businesses and not with any kind of understanding about startups and the limitations of startups by their very nature in having some of the qualifying criteria that were necessary to access the governmental assistance. And there's, a myriad examples of that through all kinds of programs in the federal government. And that is part of the challenge for us. There's so much work to be done in terms of educating. It's not just Congress. It's the executive branch agencies, the Small Business Administration, the EDA, the Commerce Department, et cetera, about the unique nature, importance, and unique needs of startups that most government programs are completely unaware of and therefore are not designed to address and provide the kind of assistance that is available for existing small businesses to new businesses. That's part of our job, is to change that. It's a very big federal government. It's going to take lots of time and lots of effort, but that's the reason why that effort that you were working on was so important and is a perfect example.
Yeah, and I think, to indulge a little bit, but I think it's a way of helping people understand also how they can approach the Center for American Entrepreneurship and engage you is going through, our issue specifically. We've been looking at entrepreneurship training, and that specifically there's an existing piece of legislation called the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Mm-hmm. And in 7 different places within the legislation, it's already written that it is designed to support entrepreneurial skills training and micro enterprise services at the federal level. But with it being administered through the Department of Labor, there's a number of administrative requirements that entrepreneurship training can't meet, which is one, you have to have an industry recognized credential. And we just acknowledge there's no entrepreneurship industry vertical to do that. So the thing that Make Startups did is we created that vertical by getting the banking sector to come together and say they would recognize a training certificate in this field. But then the second part of it is the only way to maintain funding for a program is that 80% of the people that graduated have to have a job 4 months after they complete a program. And we all know that entrepreneurs at that point in time, they're investing every penny they make into their business and leveraging debt to, get even more capital to go into their business. Right. So yeah, it's sadly, legislation is just the first step along the way.
It's a big federal government to change. In fact, one project that I'll let your listeners know about that we're doing right now, and is based on the work of an academic at George Washington named Andrew Reamer, who is doing the work for us, is we are inventorying all of the federal programs across the federal government that are designed or intended, perhaps not intelligently so, but whose intention is to assist and provide assistance for entrepreneurship and startups. So if you're trying to change this reality that you're talking about, and trying to educate regulatory and executive branch agencies, there's my cat, about the importance of startups, and to begin to include within administrative criteria startups, you have to have a baseline understanding of what's currently out there. And so we will be rolling out a user-friendly resource that will be on our website that will present all of the various programs of the federal government that are intended to provide assistance to entrepreneurs and startups. And that'll be a great place for entrepreneurs to go to just educate themselves about the programs and assistance that's out there. And then also to begin identifying the problems with those programs that need to be changed to make them more responsive and more impactful regarding the needs of entrepreneurs and startups. I'll keep you posted on when that program is finished and ready to be rolled out.
Awesome. Yeah. So then, one of the things that I did encounter, you were gracious enough to help me set up a number of meetings across the Capitol in the early days of trying to figure out our way around this workforce issue. I sense that there was a slight difference, even though it's a bipartisan issue, but I'm wondering if you see fundamental differences in how the Democratic and Republican policymakers approach entrepreneurship, and what are the best ways to engage each of them?
I think the way that I think there's an equivalent interest in the general topic of entrepreneurship and startups. There's certainly a desire on the part of elected officials to be seen as working on behalf of entrepreneurs. It's a great story to go home to your district and state with, right? I think where we see differences is in the particular aspects or which problems pertaining to entrepreneurship policymakers are most interested in. So I'll give you a perfect example. Republicans are more interested, generally speaking, in addressing regulatory burden, complexity, and uncertainty than Democrats. It's not to say that Democrats are not interested, but I think that there is a difference. I'll give you a more vivid example. Democrats are much more interested in addressing immigration reform, which is a major issue for entrepreneurs, than Republicans, certainly under the current administration. So there are differences in our broad policy agenda. All the ideas that we have under those categories I described of new ideas, talent, capital, regulation, and taxes, there are differences, there are partisan differences in the level of interest and willingness to work with us on specific policy ideas. I'll give you a perfect example of that in terms of a piece of legislation. We have worked very, very hard over the last year with Amy Klobuchar, who is the Democratic co-chair of the Senate Entrepreneurship Caucus, on a bill called the New Business Preservation Act. And this bill is intended to address the extreme concentration of venture capital in this country. 75 or 80% of venture capital is in three cities: Silicon Valley, New York City, and Boston. With the remaining 47 states and even large aspects of those three states left to share the remaining 15%. Now, venture capital is not a silver bullet. It's not the end all be all, but it's a very important resource for entrepreneurships and startups and innovation and entrepreneurship-led local economic development. So the question is it a reasonable responsibility of government to do something about trying to diversify geographically that resource of venture capital? And Amy Klobuchar and we were of the view, yes, that is a legitimate role for government, not to direct or mandate or set rules that you have to invest here or there, but to provide a framework that might incentivize venture capitalists to look outside of those three major venture capital centers at promising startups. So we spent almost an entire year working with her staff on this bill called the New Business Preservation Act. And what it would do is it would offer a 1-to-1 match for every private venture capital dollar invested in a promising startup in a place like where you're sitting would be eligible for a federal dollar of investment. All the investment decisions are made by private investors. It's not the government picking the winners and losers, but it is that the government stepping in and providing circumstances that create a very favorable investing climate for venture capitalists who are willing to get on planes and fly to the heartland states and look at promising companies. A 1-to-1 match would drop the hurdle rate for return in half. It would ramp up the aperture of potential return, and would, as I say, would create very favorable circumstances for investors. That bill was introduced in March in both the House and the Senate, so it is bicameral, but at the moment it's Democrat sponsors only. We have not been able to get a Republican to co-sponsor that bill, in part because it entails an appropriation of several $1 billion to finance the program. And at least at the time that we were, late last year, as we began trying to find a Republican sponsor, anything that costs money, Republicans are generally speaking, they're willing to spend money some places, but not in all places. We're hopeful now that in light of the damage to the economy imposed by COVID, and with all of the other large amounts of dollars that justifiably have been deployed to respond to the COVID crisis, we're very hopeful that this bill will move, particularly depending on the outcome of the election in early next year, and that because we see startups and entrepreneurship as being a key part of the economic recovery from COVID, and so policies like the New Business Preservation Act, and another one is the Endless Frontier Act. There's another one called the Ignite American Innovation Act that would change the tax code to allow startups to monetize some of the tax assets that are trapped on their balance sheets, their NOLs, the net operating losses and research and development credits that startups can't avail themselves of because they don't have an income tax liability. There's a number of these types of pieces of legislation that are designed to address the specific and unique needs of startups that are moving, in part because of the work that CAE has been doing in Washington and the creation of the caucuses in both chambers of Congress, that we are very confident are going to move the beginning part of next year.
Well, I have to say, so it's interesting to me in my time, touring around the Capitol and meeting with people that, and I think that the other thing that gives me hope is that the work you do has that potential to heal some of the partisan divide that exists between everybody, because it can become a rallying point. One of the things that I found was that I would take meetings with people about workforce policy on both sides of the aisle. Both sides of the aisle would completely support what we were trying to accomplish, but then tell me that the other side would never support it and tell me all the reasons why. And I would explain to them, well, actually, so-and-so does support it. I can put you in touch with them.
Right.
And I think that accomplished a lot. In all sincerity, this is just, sharing between colleagues. One of the things that I've encountered a lot is, on the Republican side, there's a lot of interest in trying to see, I think the opportunity zones were a monumental achievement of trying to figure out a new way to drive investment into certain markets. But at the same time, there's been a hiccup that they seem to primarily be centered around the real estate deals in these markets as opposed to the startups that are in these markets. And every time I'm on Capitol Hill, I'm asked, how are opportunity zones working? And it sounds to me like there's this opportunity to heal a divide with Senator Klobuchar's bill, and maybe seeing how that can marry up within the opportunity zone areas so that it further reinforces that legislation for whatever that's.
No, I know you're exactly right, and we see and we talk about, we lobby members of Congress on the New Business Preservation Act, making the point that it is thematically consistent and is very similar to opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are designed to get capital into distressed areas or underserved areas by way of a tax incentive. The New Business Preservation Act is designed to get venture capital into startups in underserved areas of the country by way of this one-to-one match idea. So the intention of the two pieces of legislation is the same, to get capital into underserved areas and to drive economic development. They're just coming at the problem in a different way that we actually see as being complementary. So we very much see the New Business Preservation Act as being a counterpart to opportunity zones. We also see it being a counterpart to a piece of legislation that was introduced in May by Senator Schumer on the Democratic side and Senator Todd Young on the Republican side, called the Endless Frontier Act. What the Endless Frontier Act would do is it would augment significantly the nation's commitment to research and development, and it would also establish about a dozen innovation centers focused on different aspects of innovation around the country. So again, it is designed to get innovation out into the heartland and to be contributing to economic development around the country, but by way of government investment in innovation. But of course, the way that innovation gets out into the economy is by way of new business formation, entrepreneurship. So we see the New Business Preservation Act as being a great counterpart to the Endless Frontier Act. So it's our hope that these two pieces of legislation, and then of course the Ignite American Innovation Act is a tax-based act that I described a moment ago. We're very hopeful that, given the importance of entrepreneurship and startups to the post-COVID recovery, that these bills are going to move in the first part of next year. I really think that 2021 is going to be a major year for entrepreneurship policy.
So for everyone out there that agrees in the value and importance of entrepreneurship, how can they learn more about the Center for American Entrepreneurship, and how can they engage you if they have an issue?
Sure. Well, we very much encourage contact because we rely on it, on the input and the ideas of people who get in touch with us. As I say, we go out of our way to get out of Washington on a regular basis and conduct roundtables around the United States, but we love it when people get in touch with us proactively. It's very easy to learn more and to follow CAE. Our website is, we just actually overhauled our website, so we think we have a terrific, very informative and interactive website that has our whole policy agenda, our leadership, our activities. We're also, we're in the idea business, and so we write a lot. We do lots of op-eds, lots of blog postings, lots of research reports. We are a research, policy, and advocacy organization, and those are really, the legs, three legs of the same stool, all reinforcing of each other. Our research informs our policy agenda. Our policy agenda determines our advocacy, and what we hear back from policymakers in terms of our interests, their interests, in turn determines our research agenda, our policy agenda, et cetera. And so it all works together. But our website is a great resource of information. We're active on social media. Our Twitter handle is the same as our web address. Our web address is startupsusa.org. Our Twitter handle is just without the dot. It's startupsusa.org. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Facebook. Follow us. And if people would like to get in touch directly, my email is john@startupsusa.org. I encourage anyone to reach out with problems, input, insights. And if people are interested in hosting a roundtable, we are continuing to do roundtables virtually, but by way of Zoom. In fact, we've done 4.
Even easier, right?
Sorry?
it's even easier now, right?
It's easier. You don't get quite the interaction, I mean, we love to get out of Washington and go to a different part of the country, and we tend to partner with incubators or accelerators or some sort of an entrepreneurship facility that puts 15 or 20 entrepreneurs around a table, and we do a 2-hour roundtable. It's always great fun to meet people and hear about their businesses and their challenges. But yes, I'd say we get 95% of the value of an in-person roundtable by way of Zoom. Certainly all the information in terms of challenges and problems and ideas for fixing those challenges and problems we're able to get. So if anyone is interested in hosting us, we would love to do a roundtable with entrepreneurs in their area.
That's wonderful. And then, obviously, hopefully our listeners will sign up on Team 500.
That would be great.
How else can they help you in your work?
I think, if they're help spread the word about CAE and the work that we're doing. I will tell you that because of COVID, and I don't think that this will surprise anyone, but it has made our funding circumstances, along with every other nonprofit's funding circumstances, very, very challenging. And the reason is quite simple. We rely on our funding comes from foundations, corporations, and individuals. And COVID has made the giving or philanthropic activities of all three of those categories more difficult and more challenging. Foundations are pulling back because they're concerned that grantees will not be able to perform on their grants in the context of COVID. You can't get together with people, can't do things. Corporations are under financial stress, and so have begun to cut back their philanthropic activities or become a lot more selective. And then, of course, individuals. I mean, there's a lot more uncertainty out there. A lot of people have lost their jobs, even folks who still have their jobs. There's a lot of uncertainty. So our funding circumstances have become that were already sort of, were challenging, have become much more challenging. And so a great way that people can help us is if you're interested in CA, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, public policy, tell your colleagues, friends, associates, organizations about us. There are many ways for people to get involved, in both in terms of activities as well as being a potential funder of CAE. We don't need a lot of money. As I said, we operate on a shoestring budget, but we do need to raise some in order to survive, and any help from the broad community out there would be greatly appreciated. So spread the word.
All right, John. Well, I really thank you for your time today. The work that you do inspires me, and hopefully for anyone who didn't know about it, it will inspire them as well. There's a vast network of support organizations for entrepreneurs. And I think that it's really critical that they all know the work that the Center for American Entrepreneurship is doing. It really is the vanguard for a lot of us to enable us to do this work. And I just wanted you to know that personally, I'm very grateful for everything that you do to support the environment for us.
Well, likewise, Eric, I appreciate the work that you do in our relationship. I look forward to doing more work with you in 2021. Thanks for having me on today. It's been great fun.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Make Startups podcast. This episode was produced by me, David Bash, at Augusta Podcast Studio. This episode was recorded in Augusta, Georgia. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and tell a friend about the show. We will see you very soon.